The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town of Redemption Creek as Marshal Thomas Blackwood squinted against the harsh light. At 52, his weathered face told the story of a man who had seen too much of the West's brutality. The silver streaks in his dark beard matched the scars that crisscrossed his hands, each one a reminder of battles fought and men killed in the name of justice. He adjusted the Colt peacemaker at his hip, a habit formed over 20 years of wearing the tin star, and surveyed the dusty Main Street from the shade of his office porch. The town had grown considerably since the copper mine opened 3 years ago, bringing with it the usual mix of honest workers and the parasites who fed off them. Saloons and brothels now outnumbered the general stores and churches, a fact that troubled the aging lawman more than he cared to admit. "Got another telegram from Fort Benson," said Deputy Frank Wilson, a gangly young man with eager eyes and quick hands. He handed Blackwood a folded piece of paper. "Army's sending Captain Reynolds through next week with a special prisoner. Says they need our jail for 1 night before continuing to Yuma Territorial Prison." Blackwood frowned as he read the telegram, his brow furrowing deeper with each word. "Damn military," he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist. "Always expecting us to clean up their messes." He stared toward the distant mountains that separated Redemption Creek from Apache territory, a boundary that had been tested too many times in the bloody history of the Arizona Territory. The memories of the Apache Wars still haunted him, memories of atrocities committed by both sides that no man should carry. He had been a young cavalry lieutenant then, following orders he sometimes questioned, fighting enemies he sometimes respected. Now, 20 years later, the ghosts of those days still visited him in the dark hours before dawn. Would you kindly subscribe to the channel? I'd love to know which city you're watching from. "Who's the prisoner?" Wilson asked, interrupting Blackwood's dark reverie. The deputy leaned against the porch railing, his curiosity piqued by the marshal's unusual reaction. "Tall Horse," Blackwood replied quietly, the name catching in his throat like a piece of desert grit. The Apache war chief's daughter. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Wilson whistled low, knowing enough of the border conflicts to recognize the significance. "Thought she died in the Canyon Creek massacre with the rest of her band," Wilson said, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking of the dead. "That was what, 10 years ago now?" Blackwood shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the distant mountains. "She survived, been leading raids on military outposts and settlements ever since. They say she stands 6 feet tall and can shoot a man from horseback at 300 yards. He paused, remembering a time when he'd seen her from a distance, standing proudly among her father's warriors, fearless even as the cavalry closed in. They call her the giant Apache woman in the newspapers back east. Make her out to be some kind of monster. Inside the marshal's office, the small iron stove radiated heat despite the already warm spring morning. Blackwood removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair, remembering a time when the name Tall Horse hadn't been associated with fear and bloodshed. The Apache Wars had changed everything, turning neighbors into enemies, friends into strangers. He pulled a worn leather journal from his desk drawer and thumbed through the yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for: a crude map of the Northern Territories, drawn by his own hand during his cavalry days. If Reynolds was bringing Tall Horse through Redemption Creek, it meant they were taking the old military road, a route that hadn't been used in years due to frequent ambushes. "Frank," he called to his deputy, "ride out to Miller's ranch and tell him we need extra men in town next week. I want 4 reliable guns on duty day and night while that prisoner's here." He closed the journal with a decisive snap. "And send a wire to Sheriff Donovan in Copper Springs. Tell him to keep his eyes open for any Apache moving north. Reynolds is a damn fool if he thinks her people won't try to free her." The week passed with agonizing slowness. Each day, bringing Blackwood closer to a confrontation with a past he'd tried to bury. The town buzzed with rumors about the infamous Apache prisoner, tales growing more outlandish with each retelling in the saloons and gambling halls. By the time the cavalry detachment was spotted approaching from the south, Tall Horse had been transformed in the public imagination from a flesh-and-blood woman into something mythical. A savage giant who could kill a man with a glance. Blackwood watched from his office window as townsfolk gathered along the main street, eager for a glimpse of the notorious prisoner. Children were shooed inside by nervous mothers, while men checked their pistols and muttered about Indian justice. The cavalry arrived at noon, 6 dust-covered soldiers escorting a single prisoner on horseback. Captain Reynolds rode at the front, his blue uniform crisp despite the journey, his bearing rigid with military discipline. Behind him, flanked by armed escorts, rode Tall Horse. Even from a distance, Blackwood recognized her immediately. She sat straight-backed on her horse, hands bound before her, head high with a dignity that no amount of chains could diminish. She wore a faded calico dress, prison clothing, but around her neck hung a single turquoise pendant, a small concession to her heritage. Her black hair was cropped short, another humiliation meant to strip away her identity, but her eyes remained defiant, scanning the hostile crowd with cool detachment. "Marshal Blackwood," Captain Reynolds dismounted with a salute. "Appreciate your cooperation in this matter. The prisoner needs to be secured immediately. She's caused us nothing but trouble since Fort Benson." Blackwood nodded curtly, his attention focused on Tall Horse as soldiers helped her dismount, her ankles shackled with heavy iron chains that clanked against the dusty street. Up close, she stood nearly as tall as Blackwood himself, her frame lean and strong from a lifetime in the harsh desert. A fresh bruise colored one cheekbone, and a split lip suggested she hadn't come quietly. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded street, and in that moment, Blackwood saw not the fearsome warrior of newspaper stories, but a woman fighting for her people's survival in a world that was rapidly disappearing. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of 2 enemies who understood each other better than either would admit. "She stays in your jail until tomorrow morning," Reynolds continued, oblivious to the silent exchange. "My men and I will bunk at the hotel. We ride for Yuma at first light." He handed Blackwood a sealed envelope. Her paperwork: convicted of murder, raiding, and inciting rebellion against the United States government. Sentence is life imprisonment. Though between you and me, I doubt she'll last a year in Yuma. That place breaks even the strongest spirits. The town jail was a small, sturdy building with 3 cells, usually occupied by drunks and the occasional cattle thief. Deputy Wilson had cleared out the other prisoners for Tall Horse's arrival, moving them to a temporary lockup behind the blacksmith's shop. As soldiers escorted her inside, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, angry voices calling for immediate justice rather than the formality of a prison sentence. Blackwood silenced them with a hard glare, his hand resting meaningfully on his revolver. "The law's being served here," he announced, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Anyone who thinks differently can take it up with me personally." The threat, delivered in his calm but deadly serious tone, was enough to disperse most of the onlookers. Inside, Tall Horse stood impassively as soldiers removed her shackles and locked her in the center cell. She had not spoken a word during the transfer, maintaining a stoic silence that seemed to unnerve the young soldiers more than any resistance might have. Only when the last soldier left, leaving Blackwood alone with his prisoner, did she finally move to the small cot in the corner of her cell and sit down, her dark eyes fixed on the marshal with unsettling intensity. "You were at Canyon Creek," she said in perfect English, her voice low and measured. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "You rode with Colonel Harper's men." Blackwood froze, surprised both by her speech and by the accuracy of her memory. "I was there," he admitted after a moment's hesitation. "Lieutenant Blackwood back then, 2nd Cavalry." Tall Horse nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already known. "My father always said, 'Know your enemies better than they know themselves.'" She traced the edge of her turquoise pendant with one finger. "I remember your face. You tried to stop the killing after our people surrendered. The other soldiers didn't listen." The marshal turned away, unable to meet her gaze as memories of that bloody day flooded back. Canyon Creek had been a massacre, not a battle. Women and children cut down alongside warriors, teepees set ablaze, bodies left unburied for the desert scavengers. He had indeed tried to stop it, had even drawn his pistol on a sergeant who was about to shoot a fleeing child. But in the chaos of that day, his efforts had made little difference. The official report later claimed a great victory against hostile forces. Blackwood had requested a transfer the following week. "That was a long time ago," he said finally, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Things were different then." "Not so different," she replied with a bitter smile. "Your people still want my people gone. Only now they use prisons instead of bullets. The end is the same." She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. "Why did you leave the army, Blackwood? Did your conscience finally become too heavy to carry on horseback?" Her question cut too close to the truth for comfort. Blackwood had spent years trying to atone for the things he'd witnessed and participated in during the Apache Wars, taking the marshal's badge in the hope that he could uphold a justice that applied equally to all men, regardless of the color of their skin. Too often, he had failed in that mission, constrained by a system that viewed people like Tall Horse as less than human. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot on his desk and slid it through the bars of her cell, a small gesture that did nothing to ease the burden of his complicity. "Your trial," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "Was it fair?" Tall Horse laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Fair? I was accused of killing 3 soldiers who attacked our camp. In defending my people, I became a murderer in the eyes of your law." She accepted the coffee, but did not drink it. "Captain Reynolds testified that I led a band of renegades. In truth, we were families, mothers, children, elders, trying to survive after you drove us from our ancestral lands. When we resisted being starved or marched to the reservation, we became criminals. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the small jail in shades of amber and gold. Blackwood lit the oil lamps and dismissed Wilson for the night, preferring to keep watch himself rather than subject Tall Horse to the curious stares of the younger man. A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the distant piano music, from the Silver Dollar Saloon and the occasional shout from drunken miners making their way home. Blackwood sat at his desk, pretending to focus on paperwork while his mind raced with unwelcome thoughts. The military escort would return at dawn to continue the journey to Yuma, where Tall Horse would likely die in captivity, either from disease, mistreatment, or the crushing despair that claimed so many prisoners in that hellish place. "You could let me go," Tall Horse said suddenly, her voice so quiet that Blackwood nearly missed it. She stood at the bars now, her expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. "You know this sentence is unjust." Blackwood set down his pen and met her gaze directly. "And then what? They'd hunt you down again, probably kill you on sight next time, no trial at all." "My people are camped in the high country beyond Cougar Canyon," she replied. "If I could reach them, we would cross into Mexico. The government there has offered sanctuary to some Apache bands." Her fingers tightened around the iron bars. "I'm not asking for your pity, Blackwood. I'm offering you a chance to right one small wrong in a history filled with injustice." The proposition hung in the air between them, dangerous and tempting. Blackwood had sworn an oath to uphold the law, but he had also seen how that same law could be twisted to serve the powerful at the expense of the weak. If he helped Tall Horse escape, he would be branded a traitor, possibly even hanged. If he did nothing, he would once again be complicit in a system that had committed atrocity after atrocity against her people. He stood and approached her cell, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her dark eyes and the thin white scar that ran along her jawline. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I know you won't lead a raid against this town the moment you're free?" "My war is not with the people of this town," she answered steadily. "It never was. We fought against those who would destroy us, nothing more." She reached through the bars, not touching him, but extending her hand in a gesture of peace. "I give you my word, Blackwood. No harm will come to Redemption Creek by my hand or the hands of my people if you help me now." The night deepened around the small jailhouse as Blackwood wrestled with his conscience. Outside, the town gradually fell silent. Most citizens long since retired to their beds, unaware of the moral crisis unfolding behind the jailhouse walls. Only the occasional hoot of a desert owl or the distant howl of a coyote disturbed the stillness. Blackwood paced the length of his office, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots, while Tall Horse watched him with patient eyes that had seen too much suffering to fear whatever decision he might make. Finally, as the large clock on the wall struck midnight, he came to stand before her cell once more. "Your pendant," he said, gesturing to the turquoise stone that hung around her neck. "What does it mean?" Tall Horse's hand moved instinctively to touch the smooth stone, her expression softening for the first time since her arrival. "It belonged to my grandmother. She was a medicine woman, a healer. This stone contains her spirit, her wisdom. The soldiers would have taken it, but a kind-hearted nurse at Fort Benson hid it for me." Her eyes met Blackwood's, a silent challenge in their depths. Does a monster treasure such things, Marshal? Does a savage value the wisdom of her ancestors? The question struck at the heart of Blackwood's dilemma. Throughout the long years of conflict, the Apache had been portrayed as inhuman, savages to be feared and eliminated, rather than people with their own rich culture and traditions. That dehumanization had made it easier for men to commit unspeakable acts in the name of progress and civilization. Looking at Tall Horse now, Blackwood could no longer maintain that comfortable fiction. She was not the bloodthirsty creature of newspaper stories, but a woman fighting desperately for the survival of her people and their way of life. "Can I see you without it?" he whispered, gesturing to the mask of stoicism she wore like armor. The real woman behind the legend they'd created? The giant Apache woman just smiled and took a step closer to the bars, her features softening in the lamplight. "You're the first white man who's ever asked," she said quietly. "Most prefer the legend. It justifies their fear, their hatred." She removed the turquoise pendant and held it in her palm, suddenly looking more vulnerable without this connection to her heritage. "My true name is Morningstar. Before the wars, I studied with missionaries. I can read Shakespeare and recite the Lord's Prayer. I once dreamed of being a teacher." Her smile turned bitter. "But your newspapers prefer to call me the giant Apache woman, as if my height is what makes me dangerous, rather than my refusal to watch my people die quietly." Blackwood nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. The most dangerous thing about Morningstar was not her skill with weapons or her tactical intelligence, but her ability to challenge the narrative that justified the subjugation of her people. Her very existence, educated, articulate, and unbroken, was a repudiation of everything Americans had been told about the savage Apache. No wonder the military was so determined to lock her away, to make an example of her. She represented a truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge. "My father was killed at Canyon Creek," she continued, her voice steady despite the pain that flashed across her features. "My mother and younger brother died of sickness in the first year at the reservation. Everything was taken from us: our lands, our traditions, our dignity. All we wanted was to live as we had for generations. Instead, we were treated as obstacles to be removed." She replaced the pendant around her neck, her momentary vulnerability giving way once more to quiet strength. "So yes, Marshal Blackwood, I fought back. I killed those soldiers. I would do it again to protect my people. Does that make me a criminal worthy of dying in Yuma prison?" The question hung in the air between them, impossible to answer without confronting the larger injustices that had brought them to this moment. Outside, the first hints of pre-dawn light began to creep across the eastern sky, a reminder that time was running short. Soon, Captain Reynolds and his men would arrive to continue Tall Horse's journey to a prison from which few returned alive. Blackwood made his decision, though whether it was born of conscience, atonement, or something more complicated, he could not say. He withdrew a ring of keys from his pocket and approached the cell door. "If I do this," he said, his voice low and urgent, "there's no turning back for either of us." Morningstar nodded solemnly, understanding the full weight of what he proposed. "There is a proverb among my people," she replied, "when you have made a choice, walk the path with courage, even if the stones cut your feet." She stood tall and proud before him, no longer a prisoner, but a leader preparing to guide her people to safety. "I will not forget this, Thomas Blackwood. When the stories of these days are told around Apache fires, your name will be spoken with honor." The key turned in the lock with a decisive click that seemed to echo in the stillness of the early morning. Blackwood swung the cell door open and quickly gathered supplies: a canteen of water, jerky from his desk drawer, a spare Remington revolver with ammunition. Outside, the town was still quiet, most citizens not yet risen for the day's labor. He led Morningstar through the back door of the jailhouse to the small stable where his paint mare was kept alongside the town's other horses. Working quickly and quietly, he saddled the strongest of the horses, a sturdy buckskin gelding that could handle the rough mountain terrain. "The patrol schedules haven't changed much since my Army days," Blackwood explained as he helped her mount. "There's a gap in coverage near Cougar Canyon around noon. If you ride hard, you can make it through before they realize you're gone." He handed her a rough map sketched on a piece of paper. "Follow this route. It avoids the main trails and water holes where soldiers might be watching." Morningstar studied the map for a moment before tucking it securely inside her dress. She looked down at Blackwood, her expression solemn, yet somehow lighter than before, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "What will you do now? They will know you helped me." Blackwood shrugged, a faint smile playing at the corners of his weathered mouth. "I'll say you overpowered me, took my keys while I was sleeping. It's what they'll want to believe anyway. The savage Apache warrior, too cunning and strong for an aging lawman." He rested a hand briefly on the horse's flank. "I've been thinking of retiring. Maybe this is the push I needed." She nodded, understanding what remained unspoken between them, that this single act of conscience could not erase the decades of conflict and bloodshed, but perhaps it was a small step toward a different kind of future. As the first golden rays of sunlight crested the distant mountains, Morningstar guided her horse toward the edge of town, keeping to the shadows of buildings and trees. At the final bend in the road, she paused and looked back at the man who had chosen justice over law, humanity over duty. "Farewell, Thomas Blackwood," she called softly, her voice carrying on the still morning air. "May your dreams be more peaceful than mine." Then she was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading as she rode toward the promise of freedom and the uncertain future that awaited her people across the border. Blackwood watched until she disappeared from sight, then returned to the empty jail to await the inevitable storm that would follow. He had no illusions about the consequences of his actions. At best, dismissal from his position. At worst, imprisonment for aiding a convicted criminal. Yet as he sat at his desk and prepared to face Captain Reynolds' fury, he felt a curious sense of peace. For the first time in 20 years, the ghosts of Canyon Creek seemed quieter, less accusing in their endless whispers. By mid-morning, the town of Redemption Creek was in an uproar. Captain Reynolds and his soldiers stormed through the streets, questioning citizens and organizing search parties. Blackwood had played his part convincingly, sporting a self-inflicted bruise on his temple and a story about being ambushed by the prisoner during a pre-dawn check. Few questioned this account. After all, hadn't they all heard the tales of the fearsome giant Apache woman? The idea that she might have overpowered the aging marshal seemed entirely plausible, even expected. Only Deputy Wilson looked at his mentor with knowing eyes, silently communicating that he understood more than he would ever say aloud. The military search continued for 3 days, scouring the surrounding countryside for any sign of the escaped prisoner. By the 4th day, when no trace had been found, Captain Reynolds reluctantly concluded that Morningstar had likely reached the high mountain passes and crossed into Mexico beyond their jurisdiction. He departed Redemption Creek with his men, leaving behind a formal complaint about the marshal's negligence that would eventually lead to Blackwood's early retirement from law enforcement. The town gradually returned to its normal rhythms, the excitement of the escape becoming just another story to be embellished in saloons and barbershops. 6 months later, as autumn painted the desert in subtle hues of gold and russet, Thomas Blackwood sat on the porch of his small ranch outside town, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the land. His retirement had been quiet, marked by occasional visits from Deputy Wilson, now Marshal Wilson, seeking advice or simply companionship. The scandal of Morningstar's escape had faded from public memory, replaced by newer excitements and controversies. Blackwood had found an unexpected contentment in his solitude, tending his small herd of cattle and making peace with the ghosts of his past. As twilight deepened, he noticed a rider approaching from the direction of the distant mountains, a solitary figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. His hand moved instinctively to the revolver that still hung at his side, old habits dying hard, even in retirement. But as the rider drew closer, he relaxed, recognizing the straight-backed posture and confident horsemanship, even before he could make out the features beneath the wide-brimmed hat. Morningstar dismounted at the edge of his property and approached on foot, a gesture of respect that brought a smile to Blackwood's weathered face. "I did not expect to see you again," he said by way of greeting, offering her a seat on the porch and a cup of coffee from the pot that always seemed to be brewing. "I made a promise," she replied, removing her hat to reveal hair that had grown out since her imprisonment, now adorned with a single eagle feather. No harm would come to Redemption Creek or its people. She accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "I keep my promises, Marshal." "Not Marshal anymore," he corrected gently. "Just Thomas now." He studied her face in the fading light, noting the healthy glow of her skin and the calm confidence in her eyes. Freedom had restored something essential that captivity had begun to erode. "Your people? Did they make it to safety?" Morningstar nodded, a flash of pride crossing her features. "We found sanctuary near the Sierra Madre Mountains. The Mexican government has granted us land where we can live according to our traditions." She paused, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. "It is not our ancestral home, but it is a place where our children can grow up free from persecution. For that, I thank you." They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled over the desert, each contemplating the unlikely path that had brought them to this moment of peace after so many years of conflict. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the haunting sound echoing across the empty landscape. Finally, Morningstar reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew something that gleamed in the light from Blackwood's window, a bracelet of intricately woven silver and turquoise, crafted with exceptional skill. "A gift," she said, offering it to him. "Made by our finest silversmith. Among my people, such gifts represent a bond between two souls who have shared a significant journey." Her dark eyes met his, filled with a quiet understanding that transcended words. "You made a choice that day in the jail, a choice that saved not only my life, but the lives of many of my people. This is to remind you that sometimes justice exists outside the boundaries of law." Blackwood accepted the bracelet with a solemnity that matched her own, recognizing the sacred nature of the exchange. He slipped it onto his wrist, the cool metal and smooth stone a comforting weight against his skin. "Will you stay?" he asked, the question encompassing more than just the immediate night. Morningstar shook her head. though there was no regret in her expression, only certainty. My path leads elsewhere. My people need me, especially now as we build a new life. She stood, preparing to depart as quietly as she had arrived. But I wanted you to know that your courage was not in vain, that the story did not end in that jail cell. As she mounted her horse and turned toward the distant mountains that would guide her home, Blackwood raised a hand in farewell. "Safe journey, Morning Star," he called, using her true name as a final acknowledgement of her humanity, her dignity, her right to define herself beyond the labels others had imposed. She paused, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and returned the gesture. "And to you, Thomas Blackwood. May the spirits of your ancestors guide your dreams toward peace." Then she was gone, disappearing into the vastness of the desert night, like a legend returning to the realm of myth. Blackwood remained on his porch long after she had vanished from sight, the silver and turquoise bracelet, a tangible reminder that even in the harshest landscapes of human conflict, moments of understanding and compassion could bloom like unexpected wildflowers after desert rain, in a land and time defined by boundaries, between peoples, between nations, between what was lawful and what was right. They had briefly transcended those divisions to recognize the common humanity that no amount of warfare or prejudice could fully erase. As the night deepened around his small ranch house, Blackwood felt the weight of his past grow somewhat lighter. The ghosts would never fully disappear, but perhaps they could finally rest, appeased by this one act of justice in a life marked by complicated choices and divided loyalties. He touched the bracelet on his wrist and smiled into the darkness, knowing that somewhere to the south, beyond the reach of American law, Morning Star and her people were building a future that might never have existed without the unlikely alliance formed in a jail cell at the edge of civilization. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.